You will never be the same.
And with the full catastrophe, he didn't mean it was all bad.
Oh, that I worship has a way of saying, don't play with me.
I invite you to the dance with the Lord of the dance.
God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now.
So our message today draws from the book of 1 Peter. That's 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 19. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and read that verse for you now, but you can also look at it online or down in the description as well. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you are sharing Christ's sufferings, so that you may also be glad and shout for joy when his glory is revealed. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory, which is the Spirit of God, is resting on you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, a criminal, or even as a mischief maker. Yet if any of you suffer as a Christian, do not consider it a disgrace, but glorify God because you bear this name. For the time has come for judgment to begin with the household of God. If it begins with us, what will be the end for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is hard for the righteous to be saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those suffering in accordance with God's will entrust their lives to a faithful Creator while continuing to do good. So, I want to start today with exactly the sort of thing that I'm sure my parents want me to do, because I'm sure they're listening in, and that is, I would like to start with a silly story about my father. Yeah, I know. Any kids, if you happen to be watching, keep these silly stories about your parents in mind. They make great sermons later down the line. It's a great thing to keep in your back pocket for moments like this. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this story, and it's a good one. It's one that I've told before. Some of you may have even heard me tell this story before. Back when I was much younger, actually for most of my life, my family and I, we lived in West Michigan. Now, as any of you who've been to that area probably already know, the locals really like to kind of play up certain nice things about the area so that you can focus on those and not on kind of some of the other facts about the area that I'll mention in a minute. So a lot of the locals, they'll come to you and they'll try to play up like the really nice beaches or low tax rates. Certain kinds of people will even really try to play up the ever-present crush of wildly conservative evangelicals who are just ripping through local government like a tornado made entirely out of bigotry, misogyny, and Axe body spray. Looking at you, Ottawa County. You know, they'll try to play all these things up for whatever reasons they have to distract from what really is the more memorable, noteworthy, and really surprisingly powerful thing about West Michigan. And that is the comically ridiculous weather that absolutely everybody who lives there constantly underplays. I'm serious. This is the area that came up with the idea of a polar vortex, because saying something like a lake-based hurricane system full of ice daggers and enough snow to bury a small town kind of sounded like we were bragging a little bit. This is a place where you can have 75-degree weather and a margarita on Tuesday, go snowboarding through the streets on Thursday, get torrential downpour on Saturday morning, and still have everything cleared up, sunny and dry in time for the church barbecue and potluck after worship on Sunday morning. And so far as I know, this is the only place in the world that climate change has actually made the local weather less crazy. So let's go ahead and flash back to my middle school days. It's early spring, and we've got a bit of a windstorm coming up. It's raining and it's blowing, and there is a not insignificant amount of concern that we might be getting uprooted trees, houses getting blown over, all that good stuff. Now, behind our house at the time, there was probably a good 20 or 30 yards of open space that was between the back of our house and the small window out of our kitchen. And some 20, 30 yards away, a giant, ancient, solitary tree that stood at the far back end of the yard. Now, it must have been near midnight at this point in the story. None of us could sleep, of course, due to the windstorm. The wind was howling, and there was lightning and thunder popping off left and right. And we were all just hanging out in the inside hallway with blankets and whatnot, as one does in a place with perfectly normal weather patterns. And we're hanging out there, and we hear this giant crack, followed by a loud and resounding thud that shook the whole house right down to the foundations. No doubt you just had the same immediate thought we all did at the time as well. That big ancient tree out in the backyard must have come down in the storm. So my mother yells over to my father and asks him to run into the kitchen and look out the back window so we can see exactly what happened. And of course, being a good husband, he goes and does exactly that. So he shimmies himself up to the window and starts looking out. And what happened? My mother yells out to him from the relative safety of the hallway. Did the tree come down? And I will never forget, to this day, my father's response as he looked out into the window, looked out into that wide open expanse of yard, looking to see if that great tree on the other end had come down. Now he's sitting there and he's looking carefully, he's squinting, he's moving his head around, trying to really see out into the yard. And finally he yells back, "I don't know. I can't see through all the leaves." Now, in fairness to my dad, as I mentioned before, it was round about midnight. And the man did work a fairly physically demanding job. Dude was tired, is my point. So we can have a little bit of compassion for him here. But it really did take the poor guy a few minutes to realize that he shouldn't have been seeing leaves out the back window in the first place. So I probably answered Bob's question right there. It was literally one of those can't see the forest for the trees sort of moment. I mean, more like a can't see the tree for the leaves moment, as it were. Now, of course, at the time, I just thought it was my dad being silly, which is why it's one of those memories that stayed with me all these years. But over time, I've started to realize that there's really something spiritual, something deeply human, kind of hiding out at the heart of this story. And as I read today's scripture, and as I reflected on where we are as a culture, as a people, as Americans, as English-speaking Christians in the world today, I started to see something. I think a lot of us, maybe even all of us, are having trouble seeing the tree through all them leaves. Now, I think most of us have read, or at least heard, today's passage once or twice before. Admittedly, I did not take the time to look this up in my personal archives, but I'm pretty sure I have preached on this passage at least once or twice before myself. And whenever I do come across this verse, my first impression of the message contained within it is as simple as it is important for us to consider. This is a message that is almost screamed at us loud as a windstorm in verses 12 to 14. And that message is this: suffering is part of the Christian journey. And the experience of suffering is not an indication that you've, say, strayed from the path of a God who will bend the world to see you profit and prosper. No. It's a clear sign that you're pushing against the tide of a cruel and harsh world that flows like sinful current against the gentle flow of God's redeeming and reconciliatory love. And to be clear, that message, not wrong. Now, as many of us can personally attest, when you do the work of Christ in the world, especially in this world, you're going to get your divinely inspired butt kicked. Those who stand up for the rights of the oppressed in a world that gets off on the power of oppression. Those who work to set the prisoners free in a world that would rather see prisoners suffer retribution instead of learn and grow as beloved friends and neighbors. Those who work to feed the poor and the homeless only to be arrested for violating obtuse ordinances drafted by rich white politicians in order to exercise very particular racist agendas. All of these people, all of these conflicts, they are part and partial to the following of Christ Jesus. And the consequences of those conflicts, those are the lot of those who truly commit to following the way of Christ in the world. And today's passage does in no way shy away from that very true and very timely fact. But then we get to verse 15. And like a lot of misunderstood or oddly translated or just plain weird verses that are in the Bible, this is where things start to go a little bit completely off the rails. Let's look at that verse. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, a criminal, or even as a mischief maker. It's just what exactly is that supposed to mean? I mean, look, our initial kind of instinctive reading of this verse, this interpretation that we have, is the same one that so many of our evangelical siblings will rush to in their reading of the text. And that interpretation is as simple as it is just aggressively human. Murderers, thieves, and criminals deserve their punishment, while us followers of Christ suffer without having ever committed a crime. We are innocent, you see, but those people are not. But how utterly arbitrary and how ridiculous, how hypocritical is that as a line in the sand for us to draw, flawed and imperfect as we are. And what's more, how insanely ridiculous would that line be for God to draw, the God who regularly tells us with joy abiding of the day in which all the prisoners will be set free. And you know what's more, crime itself, let's be honest, is an arbitrary social distinction too. After all, I mean, according to statistics from, say, like the Economic Policy Institute, it's actually a fairly well-known fact that wage theft, that's the deliberate theft of money or the non-payment of wages that are due to workers, wage theft is nearly 3 times greater than every other type of theft in America, to the tune of billions of dollars every year. But yet we have jails full of shoplifters and pickpockets and corporations and HR people and stuff like that. No repercussions at all. It's not even a crime. It's a civil infraction. Why is it that a boss who refuses to pay $100 in overtime wages due isn't a criminal, but a starving homeless person who steals a $5 loaf of bread is? Because the idea of what constitutes a criminal is entirely arbitrary, of course. I mean, the whole idea that some people deserve punishment is so messed up. It doesn't make sense that the scripture would be saying criminals should suffer, but Christians shouldn't. I mean, they're not even always the different things. They're often not the same thing. Christians commit crimes too. So if that's not what it's saying, why would the author of the epistle even have to warn people against suffering in the way that criminals do? I mean, who would even choose to suffer that way? Well, to get an answer to that, we need only look at the most public, prominent, would-be Christians out in our world today. How many times have we heard it said that Christianity is under threat or under attack, that Christianity is being persecuted, that Christ has somehow been taken out of our schools or our government or our public spaces or our collective hearts? How often have we seen Christians in public, despite an historically massive amalgamation of power, privilege, prestige, and visibility? How often have we seen Christians insisting that somehow we are the victims, the persecuted, the suffering, and the ones constantly under threat? Unless we pin this issue entirely on the, shall we say, more public heresies of the American evangelical movement, let's not forget that the overwhelming majority of mainline, even progressive Christianity, has spent much of the last 2 decades locked up in our aging sanctuaries, loudly and publicly lamenting the fact that we can no longer fill our open pews and our empty offering plates simply by throwing open our doors and watching with rapt fascination as our pride of position in society just pushes the masses in towards us. I mean, when was the last time we reckoned with a ministry model more complicated than ringing the dinner bell and yelling, "Church is on!" to the whole world around us? I mean, look, for a lot of us, institutionally speaking at least, we never have. I mean, we've been wrapped up in this idea that we're the ones who are losing out, that we've been watching church decline, and we've been watching as it eats up congregations around the country. We've been watching the institutional church just plummet like an airplane in free fall. And as we do, we've been preparing our hearts for that inevitable impact by wrapping ourselves in the reassurances that we find in verse 14. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory, which is the Spirit of God, is resting on you. But are we really being reviled for the name of Christ? Have we well and truly identified God's holy work in the world? Have we invested ourselves fully in it and then faced the consequences the world offers us for it? Or have we done it the other way around instead and embraced the suffering we have, chosen our suffering as a proof that our actions are already sufficiently holy, sufficiently good, and sufficiently just? regardless of the arbitrary nature of crime as a social construct, regardless of the comparison between what even constitutes a crime today versus what it did when this epistle was written, there has never been a time in history where people have deliberately and intentionally chosen to suffer in the way that a criminal would. Mind you, the author of our epistle here isn't cautioning people about embracing a life of crime itself. He's cautioning them about pursuing the suffering of a murderer, a thief, or a criminal. He's cautioning them about ignoring the reason for the suffering we endure and pursuing suffering simply for its own sake. He's reminding them of the fact that the suffering is a side effect, not the goal itself. The distinction being made here is being made for the same reason we would do well to make it today, because it's super easy to paint ourselves as a victim and then to mistake that assumed mantle of victimhood for righteousness. It is incredibly tempting to say that our suffering is the result of righteousness because it absolves us from any kind of critical thinking. It relieves us of the requirement to question the validity of our actions, to question the righteousness of our choices, and to examine whether or not we've truly been following Christ this whole time or not. When we choose to suffer as a murderer, a thief, a criminal, or indeed as any kind of mischief maker, when we make ourselves the victim, when we choose to make the suffering our focus, rather than that holy and divine work which must necessarily stir up the world around us like a rock dropped into the middle of a stagnant pond, when we do that, we lose sight of the God we are meant to follow. We stop suffering as a Christian. And those who truly suffer for the work of Christ don't need to worry about empty pews or empty plates. Those who truly suffer for the work of Christ, they don't need to build bigger buildings, make more complicated programs, throw themselves into complicated investment schemes or resource planning. They don't need to worry about growing endowments or the careful courting of potential high roller donors. When we suffer in accordance with God's will, we don't have to get lost in all of these fearful concerns, seeking constantly the ways to combat decline, to bolster attendance, or make ourselves once again great in the ways that we were before this stark and terrible time came upon us. We just need to entrust our lives to a faithful Creator while continuing to do good. You see, that right there, that's the lesson that's at play here, and it's just as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago when this was written. Do not embrace the life of suffering for its own sake. Do not be tempted by that push and pull, the back and forth of trying to stave off the dark with our own failing human efforts. Do not choose to suffer as the criminals and the mischief makers do, constantly struggling to stay one step ahead of the suffering that the world is pushing at them every day. Don't embrace the suffering that does come your way as a badge of honor without analyzing the reasons why it's come in the first place. And do not go out in search of suffering, choosing to wear the mantle of the victim just to justify yourself as righteous. Let's not get so caught up in the leaves that we can't see that tree across the yard. Let's look past the leaves. Embrace the realization that they don't even matter at all. When we do that, we will find out that if we look past the leaves, at the window, we can see clearly across the yard. And when we do that, we will find, just as my father did once he well and truly looked, that the ancient and venerable tree is still standing just as firmly as it ever has, and as it will long after we have come and gone from this place. So let us entrust our lives to a faithful Creator, ever present and ever faithful, and continue to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. Once we do that, we might find out that things aren't quite as bad as they may have seemed.